Will you be with me in a spirit of prayer? Spirit of wisdom and inspiration, move in and through us again this day. Stir up our hearts and our minds and our spirits, that we may receive a new and inspired word from you. Amen. Early in my relationship with my husband, Brian, he introduced me to one of his favorite bands. They're called Cowboy Mouth. Their live concerts are part rock concert, part inspirational speech, and 100% fun. And we went to see them in person anytime they were playing nearby. There was only one problem with attending Cowboy Mouth concerts with Brian. Brian loves to be as close to the stage as possible. And since we usually saw this band in smaller clubs or outdoor festivals, you could get pretty close to the stage. You can see better when you're closer to the front. The energy is better in the room. It is louder. Now, Brian is 6'2", and this was his perspective on the gifts of standing as close to the stage as possible. I had a slightly different perspective. Because yes, I could in fact see better, and yes, the energy from the crowd was great. But dear ones, I am exactly 5 feet tall, and being smushed into the front of the crowd also meant that I was eye level to most people's armpits or elbows, both of which were unpleasant in large concert crowds. It meant I was often hot and the air around me was usually stale and smelled like sweat and spilled beer and sometimes cigarette smoke, because there was little chance for fresh air to circulate down under everyone else's bodies to me. And I had tried to explain this to Brian, but from his lofty perch 14 whole inches above my head, it was very hard for him to understand. Until one night, he bent down and stuck his head right next to mine and actually looked at the stage from my perspective. Got down on my eye level. Wow, he said, things really do look different from down here. Right. It's a matter of our perspective. In this passage from Luke's gospel, Jesus brings new perspective, both to the bent over woman and to the synagogue leader. So for 18 years, this woman's perspective has been limited to the ground beneath her feet. She could not look people in the eye. She could not gaze up at the clouds and the stars. Day after day, her understanding of the world around her had been limited to her view of her feet and those things that lay beneath them. Then Jesus reaches out and blesses her. And now she can stand tall and take in the world around her in a whole new way, considering the people and the places around her from a totally new perspective. And as she looks around, she gives thanks to God for this new way of seeing, this new perspective on life. And then we have the synagogue leader. I imagine this is a person who has been teaching and leading his congregation for many years. He has been faithfully studying God's commandments. He has been doing his best to live a good and faithful life. He knows the importance of Sabbath, what a gift it is to have a day free from the demands of work and trade, a day set aside to worship God. And then here comes Jesus with this new perspective. What good is a day of rest if it causes us to ignore the suffering of those in our midst? What good is the law if there is no room for compassion and grace? The man is embarrassed by Jesus' words and is forced to contend with a new perspective on God's grace and faithfulness. It can be easy to paint the bent-over woman as the winner and the synagogue leader as a loser in this story. It is easy to cheer for the woman's healing from years of pain and the embarrassment of that know-it-all synagogue scholar. But this kind of explanation of this story misses Jesus' point. This is not a story about winners and losers. It's a story about all of us gaining a new perspective on the world. A perspective that seeks God's grace and mercy first. A perspective that allows us to acknowledge our own shortcomings and faults. A perspective that seeks relationship rather than shame. Elizabeth Palmer suggests that this story is a reminder that in a life of discipleship, we are always being humbled and lifted up by God's presence and call. We are at all times being asked to look for signs of God's healing and compassion, and we are constantly being challenged to examine our assumptions about who belongs in God's kingdom and who deserves God's grace and healing. This is the challenge of Jesus' perspective, to embrace a life of being humbled and being lifted up over and over, seeking God's grace and compassion in each moment and each encounter. This week, I came across these two cartoons about our perspective. In one, there are two people standing on opposite sides of a large number painted on the floor. One is telling you, "This is a 6," and the other says, "I swear this is a 9." In the other, there's a person standing on a deserted island. They see a small boat in the distance and raise their arms in excitement and yell, "A boat!" Meanwhile, this person in a boat spies the island and raises their arm in triumph, yelling, "Land!" Our perspective shapes the way we encounter the world. But we should not imagine that our perspective, that our way, is the only way or is the right way. Jesus challenges us to see the world with fresh perspective, to let go of our limited vision, and that's the way it's always been done attitude, and to open ourselves to see the world in new ways. Jesus challenges us to give up the assumption that there should always be a winner and a loser, and instead embrace a world where each of us is being lifted up and humbled by God's grace and compassion. Again, Elizabeth Palmer writes, "I imagine that when the stooped over woman stands tall and takes in the wide world around her, she sees more than just the kind eyes of a friend or fluffy clouds in a bright sky. She also sees the breadth of suffering in her world, the expansive margins that are home to the most vulnerable, the depth of disease and distress all around her. She sees that she has been raised up into a fallen world. Her widened perspective includes new culpability and new regrets. It requires broader empathy and engagement. Freed from her disease, she is free to serve a world in profound need." Palmer concludes her reflections with these words. "Perhaps instead of rejoicing in one person's exaltation over the other, We could simply aim for kindness and healing in our broken and complex world, where everyone needs to be simultaneously lifted up and humbled. Perhaps grace could replace judgment in our assessment of those who appear to be our opponents. Rather than aiming to be lifted up while our enemies are stooped down, perhaps we could focus on seeing what God reveals to us, no matter where our gaze is aimed and no matter how tall we stand. Jesus challenges us to see and serve the world with a new perspective, one that makes room for us to be lifted up and humbled by the presence of God in our world and in one another. Jesus challenges us to create relationships that are more complex and more compassionate than I win and you lose. Jesus challenges us to engage with our neighbors with an eye for God's compassion and grace, with ears to hear and understand one another's stories and truth, and with hearts that are willing to be humbled and challenged. May we do so with God's grace. Amen.